A rich and blind man chose a nanny for his daughter because of her voice. But when the woman sat at the piano and played a melody, the man began to cry as he remembered. The sun softly set over the green hills surrounding the Martinez family mansion, an imposing remnant of past generations that now seemed on the verge of being forgotten. The old walls, adorned with ivy and creeping vines, hid the secrets of a life quietly falling apart. In the distance, the whisper of the wind through the trees created a peaceful melody. But inside the walls, the atmosphere was heavy, as if a dark omen hung over the house. Sergio Martinez, once an acclaimed pianist whose melodies moved audiences worldwide, now sat in the shadow of a gazebo in the garden, his head bowed and a black blindfold covering his eyes. His blindness, caused by a mysterious illness that had suddenly struck him, had not only robbed him of his sight but also of his will to live. The world he had once known, full of colors and music, had shrunk to a place of shadows and silence. Now the only things that accompanied him were solitude and a deep sadness that seemed endless. A few meters away, his daughter Eva played alone near the pool. The 7-year-old girl had learned to fill her days in an imaginary world she had built to escape the coldness around her. Her innocent, carefree laughter contrasted sharply with the somber atmosphere of the house. Eva chased a butterfly fluttering in the air, her small feet barely touching the grass. To her, this game was a way to distract herself from the reality that surrounded her, a reality where affection always seemed out of reach. From her lounge chair, Clara, Sergio's second wife, watched the scene with almost inhuman indifference. Her cold, calculating gaze followed the girl with a certain disdain, annoyed by the noise disturbing her tranquility. For Clara, each day in that house was a burden, an unbearable monotony she coped with by seeking refuge in her own comfort. Her marriage to Sergio had begun as an opportunity to attain a life of luxury and status. But over time, the feigned love had faded, leaving only resentment. Eva, in her attempt to catch the butterfly, took a misstep. Her feet slipped on the wet edge of the pool, and in an instant, the girl fell into the water. The splash was followed by a second of eternal silence before screams of terror filled the air. Unable to swim, Eva desperately struggled to stay afloat, but panic paralyzed her. Her cries shattered the garden's calm, a plea for help that seemed to go unanswered. Sergio, sitting in the gazebo, heard his daughter's cries and felt his heart race. Desperation flooded him, knowing he couldn't see or reach her in time. Clumsily, he stood up and began moving toward the sound of the water, extending his hands in a futile attempt to orient himself. Each step was a battle against the darkness surrounding him, a darkness that now prevented him from saving his daughter. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice filled with despair. "Clara, do something!" But Clara didn't move. From her place on the lounge chair, she observed the scene with a coldness that bordered on inhuman. To her, Eva's screams were nothing more than an annoying noise interrupting her peace. Her gaze, once fixed on the child, shifted to Sergio, who was stumbling forward, unable to see what was happening. Clara had no intention of moving, not because she couldn't, but simply because she didn't want to. Sergio's desperate shouts echoed through the garden, a cry for help that seemed to fade into the air. Then Miguel, the gardener who had worked for the family for years, heard the commotion and rushed to the pool. Without hesitation, he dove into the water and reached Eva, who was beginning to sink. With a quick movement, he lifted her out of the water and placed her on the pool's edge. The terrified girl clung to Miguel, her small body trembling with fear. Hearing the splashes and Miguel's swift steps, Sergio felt a mixture of relief and bitterness. Relief that his daughter was safe, bitterness that he had been unable to protect her. Stumbling slightly, he approached as best as he could and reached out his arms for Eva, trying to comfort her. Though he couldn't see her face, he could feel her trembling body and her shallow breaths. "Dad," Eva murmured, her voice still shaky as she clung to her father. Sergio hugged her tightly, attempting to provide the safety he himself didn't feel. His mind was a storm of emotions, helplessness, anger, and sadness, all swirling within him. Meanwhile, Clara stood a few meters away, crossing her arms with a look of disgust. "It's her fault for being so clumsy," Clara said sharply. "You should punish her so she'll learn." Sergio felt the anger rise within him. He clenched his teeth, struggling to hold back the words that wanted to burst out. Taking a deep breath, he replied with frustration in his voice. "Ava is just a child," he said, trying to stay calm. "She's lost her mother, and all she needs is love and protection. You should be the one giving her that." Feeling attacked, Clara adopted a defensive stance. Her eyes narrowed and a cynical smile appeared on her face. "What she needs is discipline, not compassion. If you can't give her that, maybe you should hire someone who can." Clara's words hit Sergio like a stone in his heart. The truth was, ever since Elena's death, his first wife, the house had become a place of pain and emptiness. Clara had come into his life as a promise of new happiness, but that promise had quickly faded, leaving only a cold, loveless marriage. Elena, the woman who had been his light, his inspiration, was gone too soon, and since then, Sergio had fallen into a spiral of sadness that had led him to his current state of despair. His blindness was not just physical but emotional, a blindness that had distanced him from everything he once loved. The day ended with a sense of bitterness in the air. The house, with all its wealth and comforts, felt empty, devoid of the warmth that once filled it. Holding Ava in his arms, Sergio wondered if he would ever see the light again, not just with his eyes but with his heart. As night fell, Sergio made a silent decision. He needed to find a way to bring life back to his home, for Ava's sake, for Elena's memory, and for his own survival. The incident at the pool left a lingering sense of unease in the Martinez household. Although Ava recovered quickly, the tension between Sergio and Clara grew more palpable. Sergio couldn't stop thinking about his wife's indifference, and his concern for his daughter's well-being became more pressing. A few days after the incident, Clara insistently suggested that they hire a nanny for Eva. According to her, the girl needed someone who could care for her constantly, as Sergio, with his blindness, couldn't do so properly. Although reluctant, Sergio decided that perhaps it was the best thing for Eva. After all, he had already recognized his limitations. The interviews for the nanny position began the following week. Sergio, seated in his study, listened attentively to the voices of the candidates, while Clara asked the questions. Although the women who came by seemed experienced, none of them captured Sergio's attention until Sophia arrived. When Sophia entered the room, Sergio noticed something different in her tone of voice. It was warm, gentle, and sincere. Despite her youth and lack of experience, there was something about her that resonated with him. Clara, however, didn't seem impressed. She thought Sophia was too young and lacked the necessary qualifications to care for a child like Ava. But before Clara could reject her, Ava, who had been watching from the door, ran up to Sophia and took her hand. "Dad, I like her," Ava said, smiling at Sergio. "Can she stay?" Touched by his daughter's reaction, Sergio felt he should give Sophia a chance. He decided to trust Ava's instinct, which rarely showed such enthusiasm for anyone new. "All right, Sophia," Sergio said calmly. "We'll give you a chance. I hope you can fit in with our family." Sophia accepted with a smile, grateful for the opportunity. From that moment, she began working as Ava's nanny, and before long, her presence started to bring a positive change to the household. Ava, who had previously spent most of her time alone, was now constantly in Sophia's company. Together, they played in the garden, read books, and talked about everything that crossed the mind of a 7-year-old. Slowly, Eva began to show signs of happiness, something Sergio hadn't seen in a long time. Although Sergio couldn't see the changes, he sensed them. He noticed that Eva laughed more, that there was less silence in the house. Even the few moments when Sophia and he exchanged words were enough for him to realize that the young woman was having a positive influence on his home. However, not everyone was pleased with Sophia's arrival. Clara, who had initially supported the idea of hiring a nanny, began to feel uncomfortable. She was bothered by the closeness between Sophia and Ava, feeling that she was losing control of the family dynamic. Although she had never been particularly close to Ava, Sophia's presence reminded her of her own indifference, which only fueled her resentment. Despite these tensions, Sophia continued to do her job with dedication. She treated Eva with sincere affection, something the girl desperately needed. And although it was still early, Sergio began to feel that for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope in his home. As the days passed, Sergio began to open up more to the idea that life in his house could improve. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, especially with Clara's attitude, but Eva's smile and Sophia's calming presence gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Summer slowly progressed at the Martinez mansion, bringing with it longer and warmer days. Sophia had adapted well to her new role as Eva's nanny, and the house, once full of shadows, was beginning to feel a little warmer. However, there was something about Sophia that intrigued Sergio. Though he couldn't see her, there was a familiarity in her voice, in the way she spoke, that stirred faint memories in his mind. One afternoon, while Eva took a nap, Sergio decided to take a walk through the house. Though blindness had forced him to depend more on others, he refused to give up his independence completely. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, letting his senses guide him through the rooms he knew so well. Without knowing exactly why, he made his way toward the music room. It was a place he had avoided since losing his sight, a constant reminder of what he had been and what he could no longer do. However, something drew him in, as if an invisible force were pulling him toward that space that had once been so important to him. As he approached the door, he heard a melody fill the air. It was soft, melancholic, and echoed through the walls of the room. Sergio stopped, listening carefully. With each note, something inside him stirred, an emotion that had been dormant for a long time. He recognized the piece immediately. It was a melody he had composed years ago, inspired by a love that had been left in the past. With his heart pounding, Sergio pushed open the door and stepped into the music room. There, sitting at the piano, was Sophia, playing with a delicacy that only someone who deeply understood music could display. Sergio stood still, letting the music carry him away, feeling how each note transported him to another time and place. When the melody ended, Sergio slowly approached the piano. Sophia, noticing his presence, turned toward him, somewhat surprised. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here," she said softly. "Don't worry," Sergio replied, his voice filled with a mix of emotions. "That melody, where did you learn it?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before answering. "My mother taught it to me. She used to play it when I was little. She said it was one of her favorites." Sergio felt a lump in his throat. That music, that particular melody, had been a crucial part of his life. It had been the soundtrack of a love that had faded, a love he had shared with a woman named Maria. Maria had been his first love, a young woman who, like him, was passionate about music. Together, they had dreamed of a future full of melodies, but life had taken them down different paths. "What's your mother's name?" Sergio asked, feeling as if he already knew the answer. "Maria," Sophia replied with a nostalgic smile. "Maria Lopez." The name dropped like a bomb in Sergio's mind. Maria Lopez. The same name he had whispered in his dreams, the same name he had tried to forget. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Could it be that Sophia was the daughter of Maria, the woman who had once been the center of his world? Memories began flooding Sergio's mind. He remembered how his relationship with Maria had fallen apart when his career took off and he chose his ambitions over love. He had left Maria behind, choosing fame and success over the stability of true love. It had been a decision he had always regretted, even if he had never admitted it out loud. Sophia, seeing the expression on Sergio's face, realized that something important was happening. She decided to share more about her mother. "My mother always spoke about a man who changed her life, someone she loved deeply but with whom things didn't work out. She didn't give me many details, but I always knew there was something special about their story." Sergio felt a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, nostalgia, and a renewed interest in the life he had left behind. The idea that Sophia, the young woman who had brought some light into his home, was Maria's daughter left him stunned. "Sophia, your mother and I," Sergio began, but the words escaped him. He didn't know how to continue, how to explain what he felt. "Your mother and I shared something very special a long time ago." Sophia nodded, understanding that the connection between her mother and Sergio was deeper than she had imagined. She decided not to press Sergio for more details, but from that moment, she felt there was a stronger reason for her to be there, a reason that went beyond her job as a nanny. For the rest of the day, Sergio remained in the music room, thinking about everything that had happened. The revelation that Sophia was Maria's daughter forced him to confront his past, the decisions he had made, and the emptiness those decisions had left in his life. He knew he had to do something, that he couldn't ignore this new opportunity for redemption. The melody Sophia had played continued to resonate in his mind, reminding him that even though his world was now filled with shadows, there were still possibilities of finding light. And with that melody in his heart, Sergio began to think about how he could help Sophia and Maria, and perhaps find some peace for himself. The discovery that Sophia was Maria's daughter left Sergio with a mixture of emotions. There was something about her presence that both unsettled and comforted him at the same time. The music, the memories, Sophia's gentle voice, everything seemed to reconnect him with a part of his life that he thought had been lost forever. But at the same time, Sophia's closeness to Eva and the positive influence she had on the household began to disrupt the fragile dynamic of the home, especially with Clara. Clara, who had initially been pleased with the idea of a nanny taking over the responsibility of caring for Eva, began to show signs of discomfort. She was irritated by how easily Sophia gained Eva's trust and affection. Despite never having shown genuine interest in the girl, the closeness between them seemed to threaten her control over the family situation. Sergio, on the other hand, began to trust Sophia more and more. Their conversations, though brief, brought him a sense of relief he hadn't felt in a long time. However, he knew there was something else he needed to focus on. The memories of the past intertwined with his present, and for the first time, he allowed himself to think about how he might right the wrongs of his youth. He thought about Maria, the life he could have had with her, and how much he owed her for walking away. Meanwhile, Ricardo, Sergio's best friend and a figure who had been in his life for years, grew increasingly concerned about Sergio's condition. Ricardo had always been an observant man, and ever since Clara had entered Sergio's life, he had noticed certain details that didn't quite add up. Things had changed drastically after Sergio lost his sight, and although at first he thought it was a natural consequence of the illness, something about Clara's behavior unsettled him. Determined to investigate further, Ricardo began reviewing Sergio's medical reports and analyzing his symptoms. The more he dug, the more suspicions he had. The dates and diagnoses didn't entirely match, and some details seemed to have been overlooked intentionally. Without telling Sergio, Ricardo decided to delve deeper into the treatments Clara had been administering to his friend. One day, while Clara was away, Ricardo seized the opportunity to speak to Sergio in private. He knew that the information he had uncovered could be devastating, but he felt his friend deserved to know the truth. "Sergio, I've been doing some research on your condition," Ricardo began cautiously. "Something doesn't add up." Sergio frowned, somewhat confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, sitting up in his chair, his head tilted toward Ricardo. "I've gone over your medical reports and the dates of your treatments," Ricardo continued seriously. "It doesn't make sense. The symptoms of your blindness don't align with the disease you're supposed to have." Sergio remained silent for a moment, processing what Ricardo was telling him. "And what do you think is going on?" he finally asked, his voice lower. Ricardo took a deep breath before answering. "I think Clara has been giving you something that's affecting you. I've looked into some of the medications she's been giving you, and there are indications that they could be contributing to your blindness." Sergio felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. The idea that Clara, the woman he had married, could be poisoning him hit him with a force he hadn't expected. He didn't want to believe it, but at the same time he couldn't ignore the facts Ricardo was presenting. "Are you sure?" Sergio asked with a mix of disbelief and pain. "I don't have definitive proof yet, but what I've discovered so far is enough to raise alarms. We can't let this continue. Sergio nodded slowly, feeling a storm of emotions building inside him. Clara's betrayal, if true, would be devastating. But beyond that, he felt anger at having been manipulated, at having trusted someone who perhaps had never truly loved him. Seeing the expression on his friend's face, Ricardo decided not to push further at that moment. Take your time to process this, Sergio. I just wanted you to know, and remember, you're not alone in this, Ricardo said, placing a hand on his shoulder before leaving. That night, as the house remained silent, Sergio couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, trying to process what Ricardo had told him. If Clara was indeed behind his blindness, everything in his life would change. But on the other hand, he couldn't afford to remain passive. He had Eva, and somehow he felt that Sophia was also involved in his search for answers. The next day, Clara behaved as if nothing had happened. Her distant and haughty attitude no longer went unnoticed by Sergio. Now he saw her in a new light. Every gesture, every word made him question her true intentions. Determined not to be deceived any longer, Sergio began to plan a way to uncover the truth, with Ricardo's help. Meanwhile, Sophia continued caring for Eva with the same dedication and affection as always. For her, her job at the Martinez mansion was more than just employment. It was an opportunity to change the lives of those around her. Unknowingly, Sophia found herself in the middle of a much larger conflict, one that would test her ties to Sergio and her future in that house. Days passed slowly in the Martinez mansion, but the atmosphere was changing. Sergio, still coming to terms with the suspicions about Clara, became increasingly focused on what he could do to protect Eva and himself. Ricardo's revelation had shaken his world, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose, to discover the truth and somehow atone for the mistakes of the past. One afternoon, while Sergio was in his study, he heard Sophia and Eva in the living room. Eva's laughter was clear and joyful, a sound that always filled Sergio's heart with a mix of happiness and pain. He had been reflecting on his conversation with Sophia in the music room days ago, and he knew he needed to delve deeper into Maria's story. Determined to help, Sergio called Sophia into the study. The young woman entered with a smile, though she noticed that Sergio seemed more serious than usual. "Sophia, I've been thinking about what you told me about your mother," Sergio began, his tone thoughtful. "And I think I want to help you find a way to support her. She was someone very important in my life, and I feel like I owe her a lot." Sophia was surprised by the offer, but she also felt warmth in knowing that Sergio cared about her mother. "I don't know how to thank you, Sergio," she replied gratefully. "My mother has been fighting for years to get my sister, Isabella, back. The director who took her away from us is a very powerful man, and so far we haven't had the resources to fight him." Sergio nodded, determined to do whatever was necessary. "I have some contacts who could help us," he said. "But first I'd like to understand the situation better. What can you tell me about this director and what he did to your mother?" Sophia sat down and began to tell the story. The director of the school where Maria had worked had manipulated the situation to take custody of Isabella, using his influence and power to keep Maria away from her daughter. He was a corrupt man with connections in high places, and he had used every tool at his disposal to ensure Maria couldn't fight back. As Sophia spoke, Sergio's determination grew. He knew facing someone like this wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. After hearing everything, Sergio decided the first step was to build a solid case against the director. "I'll talk to Ricardo," Sergio said after a moment of silence. "He has experience with these kinds of situations, and together we can start moving the necessary pieces. Don't worry, Sophia. We'll do everything we can to help your mother get Isabella back." Sophia, visibly emotional, nodded gratefully. This gesture of kindness from Sergio not only deepened her respect for him, but also gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Later, Sergio met with Ricardo in private and told him about Maria's situation and his desire to help. Ricardo, though surprised by the connection between Sophia and Sergio's past, understood the importance of what his friend was asking. He immediately began working on contacting a team of lawyers specializing in family rights and gathering all the information they could about the director. While the plan was set in motion, Sophia continued caring for Ava, who showed a noticeable change in her behavior. The girl seemed happier, more confident, and her progress did not go unnoticed by Sergio. Though there was still much to resolve, seeing his daughter flourish under Sophia's care gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. However, Sophia's positive influence in the house was not welcomed by everyone. Clara, increasingly aware of the closeness between Sergio and Sophia and the change in Ava's attitude, began to feel she was losing control. Though she tried to hide her true feelings, her resentment towards Sophia became more evident with each passing day. Despite the growing tension, Sergio focused on the plan to help Maria. Alongside Ricardo, they began gathering evidence, contacting former colleagues, and preparing the case against the director. They knew it would be a difficult fight, but they were determined to move forward. Sergio, driven by guilt and the need for redemption, found in this mission a purpose that kept him grounded, despite the doubts that haunted him in the darkness of the night. Sergio knew this battle wouldn't be quick or easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing the right thing. Not just for Maria, but also for Sophia, Ava, and ultimately for himself. Sophia's presence hadn't only brought light into Ava's life, it had also begun to illuminate the shadows in his own heart. Meanwhile, Clara watched everything from a distance, growing more uneasy with the changes she saw in Sergio. Her control over him, which had once been nearly absolute, seemed to be slipping away, and the fear of losing him, along with everything she had built, began to take hold of her. Sergio, however, was more determined than ever. With Ricardo by his side and Sophia as his inspiration, he was ready to face any obstacle to achieve justice for Maria and her daughter. It was a path full of uncertainties, but also of hope, and Sergio knew he couldn't give up. Weeks passed, and the plan to help Maria was slowly progressing. Ricardo had contacted some of the best lawyers and private detectives, who began investigating the corrupt director who had manipulated the situation to keep Isabella away from her mother. However, as they delved deeper into the case, disturbing details about Sergio's situation began to emerge. Ricardo, while still working on Maria's case, continued investigating the circumstances surrounding Sergio's blindness. His concern for his friend had not diminished since discovering irregularities in the treatments Clara had administered. He knew he had to be cautious, but also act quickly before it was too late. One day, after a long meeting with the lawyers, Ricardo headed to the Martinez mansion to speak with Sergio. He had been gathering evidence and now had confirmation of his worst suspicions. Clara had been slowly poisoning Sergio, giving him small doses of a substance that not only affected his vision, but also his emotional state. Ricardo found Sergio in his study, where he spent most of his days. He sat down in front of him, his expression serious, and began to speak cautiously. "Sergio, I found something you need to know," Ricardo said, cutting straight to the point. "What I'm about to tell you isn't easy, but it's the truth." Sergio, who had been lost in his thoughts, lifted his head, giving his full attention to his friend. "What is it?" he asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in his voice. Ricardo took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been investigating the medications Clara's been giving you, and I've discovered they contain a substance that can cause temporary blindness and depression. Everything points to her deliberately poisoning you, probably for months." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Sergio remained motionless, as if Ricardo's words had not yet fully penetrated his consciousness. But gradually, the reality of what his friend was saying began to sink in. "Poisoning me?" Sergio repeated softly, as if testing the word, trying to make sense of it. "No, it can't be." Ricardo nodded, his expression filled with sadness. "I'm sorry, Sergio, I know it's hard to believe, but the evidence is there. Clara has been manipulating your health to keep you dependent on her. I can't say for sure how long she's been doing this, but the effects are clear." Sergio felt his world crumble. The woman he had shared his life with since Elena's death, The woman he had trusted had betrayed him in the worst possible way. A mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness overwhelmed him, leaving him speechless. How could she do this to me?" he finally murmured, unable to fully grasp what he was hearing. Ricardo placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, my friend, but what I do know is that we can't let this continue. You need to confront her, and you also need medical help to detoxify and recover." Sergio nodded slowly, feeling determination begin to build inside him. He knew Ricardo was right. He couldn't continue living in darkness, both physically and emotionally. He had to take control of his life again for himself and for Eva. "How do I do it?" Sergio asked, seeking guidance. "How do I face all this without her seeing it coming?" Ricardo had thought about this and had a plan. "The first thing you need to do is talk to a doctor you can trust, one who isn't under Clara's influence. You need to undergo tests and start a treatment to reverse the effects of the poison. In the meantime, we'll make sure Clara doesn't suspect anything. We'll keep up appearances until you're strong enough to confront her." Though still stunned by the revelation, Sergio nodded again. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't allow Clara to continue controlling him. He had to be strong, for himself and for his daughter. "And about Maria's case," Sergio added after a moment, "I don't want this to affect what we're doing for her. She deserves justice too, and I don't want Clara interfering with that." Ricardo smiled with understanding. "Don't worry, we'll handle both things. Just make sure you follow the doctor's instructions and stay calm. I'll take care of the rest." Sergio felt a slight sense of relief hearing his friend's words. He knew he wasn't alone in this and that. He had someone he could fully trust. While Ricardo handled the details, Sergio began mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to take back his life and protect those he loved. That night, while Clara slept peacefully, Sergio lay awake, his thoughts spinning around the betrayal and the uncertain future awaiting him. But despite everything, for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. He knew he was at the beginning of a long process, but he also knew that with Ricardo by his side and the truth on his side, he could get through it. The first step would be to talk to a trusted doctor and begin the detoxification process. Then would come the moment to confront Clara, but Sergio knew he had to wait for the right time. Everything had to be done carefully, so as not to endanger himself or Eva. Sergio, now with a clear plan in mind, closed his eyes and tried to rest. He knew the next day would mark the beginning of his recovery, and though the path would be arduous, he was determined to see it through to the end. The day had come. As Sergio prepared to face his reality and take steps to recover his health, Maria's case against the corrupt director was also gaining momentum. The lawyers and private detectives, led by Ricardo, had worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a strong case. They knew they were up against a powerful opponent, but they also knew that the truth was on their side. The trial was set to begin that week, and the pressure was palpable. Maria, despite being a strong woman, felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The idea of facing the man who had taken her daughter away was terrifying, but she also knew she couldn't give up. With Sophia's support, who had been by her side throughout the process, and the certainty that Sergio and Ricardo were doing everything possible to help her, Maria gathered the courage for what was to come. The first day of the trial was tense. The director, a man who had manipulated the system to his advantage for years, arrived at the court with a confident attitude, surrounded by expensive lawyers and an arrogant smile on his face. However, that confidence began to waver as Maria's lawyers presented their initial evidence. Documents proving the director's corruption and abuse of power, along with testimonies from people who had been victims of his manipulations, began to paint a clear picture of his guilt. Sophia, sitting beside her mother in the courtroom, watched attentively as the case unfolded. She knew that every word, every piece of evidence presented was another step toward justice for her family. Although the director continued trying to intimidate witnesses and manipulate the situation, it was clear that he was losing ground. Meanwhile, Sergio, who couldn't attend the trial due to his condition, stayed home, following the progress through Ricardo's updates. Despite not being physically present, his support was unwavering. He had spoken with a trusted doctor and had begun the detoxification process. Though the road to recovery would be long, he felt more optimistic than he had in a long time. He knew he was on the right path, not only to regain his health, but also to achieve justice for Maria. The trial continued for several days, each more intense than the last. Maria's lawyers presented increasingly compelling evidence, and key witnesses began testifying in her favor. The director, who had initially displayed a dismissive attitude, began to show signs of concern. He knew his reputation and power were at stake, and with each passing day it became more evident that he wouldn't get out of this situation easily. Though exhausted from the stress of the trial, Maria remained strong. Every time she looked at Sophia, she felt a renewed determination to keep going. She knew she wasn't just fighting for herself, but also for her daughter Isabella, who had been separated from her for so long. As the trial progressed, Clara, back at the Martinez mansion, began noticing changes in Sergio. Though he had tried to maintain appearances, Clara had a sixth sense for noticing when something wasn't right. However, Sergio, following Ricardo's advice, remained calm and revealed nothing about what was happening. He knew he had to wait for the right moment to confront her. Finally, the trial reached its climax. Maria's lawyers presented their final case, a combination of evidence, testimonies, and legal arguments that left the director with few options. When the judge announced that he would take time to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The waiting days were agonizing. Maria and Sophia tried to stay busy, but the uncertainty over the verdict was hard to ignore. Ricardo continued keeping Sergio informed about every detail, assuring him that everything was going according to plan. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed with people, all waiting to hear the final decision. Maria, with her heart in her throat, held tightly to Sophia's hand as the judge prepared to speak. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing the testimonies, the judge began in a solemn tone, "The court has reached a conclusion." The silence in the room was absolute. Maria could barely breathe. This court finds the director guilty of abuse of power and manipulation of the system. As a result, it is ordered that custody of Isabella be immediately returned to her mother, Maria Lopez. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment everything was silent. Then a wave of relief and emotion swept through the place. Maria, unable to contain her tears, hugged Sophia tightly. They had won. After years of struggle, they had achieved justice and regained Isabella. Meanwhile, at the Martinez mansion, Sergio received the news with a mix of relief and joy. He knew he still had a long road ahead in his own battle, but the success of the trial gave him renewed hope. He was determined to continue with his plan to confront Clara and take back control of his life. The trial had ended, but the story of Sergio, Maria, and Sophia was far from over. With the director defeated and Clara growing increasingly uneasy, the next steps would be crucial in determining the future for all of them. With Maria's trial concluded and justice finally served, attention shifted back to the Martinez mansion. Sergio, now aware of Clara's betrayal and determined to reclaim his life, knew the time to confront her had come. However, he had to proceed with caution. He and Ricardo had planned every detail of the confrontation, ensuring Clara would have no chance to escape the consequences of her actions. That afternoon, when the house was quiet, Sergio called Clara into the study. His voice echoed through the house, sharp and leaving no room for doubt. Clara, who had sensed a shift in the atmosphere for days, knew something wasn't right. She walked into the study with measured steps, trying to maintain her composure, though internally she was filled with unease. "What's going on, Sergio?" Clara asked, trying to sound casual but with a slight hint of nervousness in her voice. Sergio remained silent for a moment, observing Clara with an intensity that made her shiver. Finally, he rose from his chair, leaning on his cane, and stared at her. Even though his blind eyes couldn't see, his determination was palpable. "I know what you've been doing, Clara," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "And today, it ends." Clara felt a knot in her stomach, but tried to keep her facade of innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to sound confident, but her words were starting to betray her. Sergio took a step toward her, his expression hard, and his voice filled with restrained anger. "Don't you dare lie to me, Clara," he shouted, his voice reverberating off the study walls. "I know you've been poisoning me, manipulating me to keep me blind and under your control, all for your own benefit." Sergio's words hit Clara like a hammer, leaving her momentarily paralyzed with shock. But instead of admitting the truth, she chose to strike back, letting her mask of innocence fall. "So what if I did?" Clara spat, stepping closer to Sergio with fury in her eyes. "Yes, I did, because I couldn't stand to see you wallowing in that miserable life you built for yourself, because I couldn't bear to watch you tied to the ghost of Elena and that damned blindness that made you useless." Sergio felt a surge of anger hearing Clara's words. The fragile image he had tried to maintain of her shattered into 1,000 pieces. Everything he had feared was confirmed in that instant. "You're despicable," Sergio shouted, taking another step toward her. "You took my sight, robbed me of years of my life, made me depend on you like a damned prisoner, and you did it all for your selfish gain." Clara, far from being intimidated, was consumed by hatred. Her eyes narrowed, and the cynical smile on her face was that of someone who had nothing left to lose. "What are you going to do, Sergio?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Are you going to report me? Get rid of me and pretend I never existed? You're not as strong as you think." Sergio felt his anger burn within him like an uncontrollable fire. He knew Clara was trying to provoke him, to manipulate him one last time. But he wouldn't allow it. "You're going to leave my life, Clara," he declared with a firmness that left no room for argument. "I've spoken with my lawyers. You'll receive the divorce papers, and you'll leave this house. I don't want to see you ever again. I won't allow you to keep poisoning my life or Eva's." Clara let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded more like a desperate scream. "You won't get rid of me that easily," she shouted, stepping closer to Sergio, her face inches from his. "I've sacrificed everything for this life for you, and I won't let you take it from me without a fight. You have no idea what I'm capable of." At that moment, Clara abruptly turned and stormed out of the study, leaving Sergio with adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew this wasn't over. He knew Clara wouldn't leave without causing havoc, and he was right. That night, as Sergio tried to process what had happened, he heard strange noises in the house. They were hurried footsteps, whispers, and the sound of things crashing to the floor. He quickly got up, feeling fear and anger mixing inside him. He knew Clara was behind this and that she wouldn't stop at anything. Sergio left his room and headed toward the main hall, following the sounds. When he arrived, he found the house in a state of complete chaos. Drawers were open, furniture overturned, and many of his valuables were gone. Clara and her brother Roberto had broken into the house, stealing everything they could in one final act of revenge. "Clara," Sergio shouted, his voice filled with fury, "get out of my house. This doesn't belong to you." Clara, who was in the middle of taking more items, stopped when she heard Sergio's voice. She turned on her heel and looked at him with a mix of hatred and satisfaction. "This isn't over, Sergio," she shouted back. "I'll make you pay for this, you bastard. You'll regret underestimating me." Sergio advanced toward her, every step laden with years of pent-up rage. Sergio's final confrontation with Clara was a defining moment in his life. As he watched her and Roberto disappear from his home, he could feel the weight of years of manipulation and betrayal lift from his shoulders. The chaos they left behind was nothing compared to the turmoil they had caused in his life. But now, for the first time in years, Sergio had reclaimed control. He had faced his fears, expelled Clara from his life, and was ready to walk the long road ahead toward freedom and healing. Sitting down in the living room, Sergio took a deep breath. He was exhausted, but there was a renewed determination within him. He knew that with Ricardo, Sophia, and his legal team by his side, he could protect himself and, most importantly, Eva. Clara's reign of control was over, and though she had tried to destroy everything, Sergio's spirit remained unbroken. The mansion, now quiet, was no longer filled with the oppressive silence it once had been. It was a silence of peace, of relief, as if the house itself had breathed a sigh of release after the storm that had torn through its walls. With Clara and Roberto gone, a sense of freedom settled over the mansion that Sergio hadn't felt in years. Ricardo was there every step of the way, helping Sergio rebuild what Clara had tried to destroy. The first priority was ensuring their safety, changing the locks, increasing security, and making sure Clara would have no way of returning. But physical security was just the beginning. Sergio knew that both he and Eva needed to heal emotionally from all they had endured. Eva, having witnessed much of the tension in the house, had found solace in her growing bond with Sophia. The young woman had brought light and warmth into their lives, and her presence had been a stabilizing force for both Sergio and his daughter. Sophia had become a pillar of strength for Eva, who slowly began to rediscover the joy that Clara's coldness had stolen from her. For Sergio, the battle wasn't over yet. While he had triumphed over Clara, he felt his role in this journey extended beyond the legal victory. He had made a promise to Maria to help her rebuild her life after years of suffering and uncertainty. Now that Isabella was finally reunited with her mother, Sergio knew that their real journey had just begun, a journey of healing, hope, and new beginnings. Days later, Ricardo organized a small gathering at the mansion to celebrate the legal victory and to look toward the future. Maria arrived with Sophia and Isabella, their faces bright with joy, though still shadowed by the emotions of their long battle. When Sergio greeted them, it was with a smile filled with warmth and sincerity. The smile reflected not only the relief of winning the fight, but also a deep commitment to their future. As everyone settled into the elegant but cozy living room, Sergio looked directly into Maria's eyes. There was a weight to his words, but also a determination that carried them. "Maria," he began, his voice firm yet gentle, "I want you to know that everything I've done so far has been for you and Sophia, to give you both the best chance possible, but I also know this isn't the end. I feel like there's so much more I can do, and I want to help you continue to rebuild your life." Maria, still overwhelmed by the emotions of being reunited with her daughter, smiled gratefully, though there was a hint of disbelief in her expression. "Sergio, you've already done so much. I don't know how we can ever thank you enough," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity and awe at his generosity. Sergio gently shook his head, as if to dispel the notion that he sought any recognition for his actions. "You don't need to thank me, Maria. What I truly want is for you and Isabella to have the life you both deserve, a life filled with peace and opportunities." He paused, organizing his thoughts before continuing. "I've thought about this a lot, and I want you to know that I'd like to support Isabella's education, so you never have to worry about her future. And I also want you to have the resources to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be. I want you to feel free to make your own choices without being limited by what's happened in the past." The emotion in Maria's eyes was immediate. She struggled to find the right words to express what she was feeling, but the intensity of her gratitude and surprise was clear. "Sergio, I don't even know what to say," Maria whispered, her voice trembling as tears of gratitude welled up in her eyes. "This is more than I ever could have dreamed of." Ricardo, who had been quietly listening, decided to chime in, adding a thoughtful touch to the conversation. "Maria, Sergio and I have talked about this at length. We want this to be a fresh start, not just for you and Isabella, but for all of us. We've all been through some very hard times, and I think it's time we start looking toward the future with hope, not just in material things, but emotionally as well. We all deserve some peace after everything we've been through." Sophia, who had been observing from a corner, nodded in agreement. She too had felt the weight of all they had experienced, and Ricardo's words resonated deeply with her. "I agree," Sophia finally said. "We all need a fresh start, and I'm glad we can do it together, like a real family." The conversation continued, but now with a different air. There was a sense of renewal, of shared hope. of a future that was beginning to take shape more clearly. They discussed not only Maria and Isabella's plans, but also Sergio's, who had decided to reconnect with one of his greatest passions, music. Though he knew his blindness would continue to challenge him, he also felt that he had found a new reason to move forward, a reason that gave him purpose. With Ricardo and Sophia's support, Sergio began planning a private concert at the mansion, something that would symbolically represent his rebirth. The music, which had been absent from his life for so long, was slowly returning, and he was ready to embrace it again. Playing the piano without sight was a challenge, but he soon realized that music was not just about technique, it was about the soul. And after everything he had been through, his soul was ready to tell its story through every note he played. Meanwhile, Maria and Sophia started shaping their dreams, carefully planning for the future with optimism and gratitude. Life was offering them a new opportunity, and they didn't intend to waste it. With Sergio's emotional and financial support, Maria, who had faced many hardships over the years, decided it was time to return to her passion, teaching. From a young age, she had dreamed of being a teacher, and despite the obstacles life had placed in her path, her love for education had never diminished. Now, with the stability of her new life, she could return to the classroom, not only to teach, but also to learn from her students. Isabella, too, shared that excitement. The young girl was not only thrilled at the prospect of attending a good school, but also saw this change as a chance to grow and learn. She knew her mother was making great sacrifices for her future, and that strengthened the bond between them in an indescribable way. Each day, mother and daughter found new ways to connect and support each other. Sophia, as always, stood by their side, offering advice and encouragement, serving as a pillar in their lives. Days passed, and little by little, the Martinez mansion, which had once been a place of darkness and silence, began to transform. The echoes of pain and the shadows that had once haunted its walls were replaced by laughter, by natural conversations, and by the sound of the light footsteps of those who were starting to rebuild their lives. The once empty and dull rooms now vibrated with the renewed energy of those who inhabited them. It was as if every corner of the house had found its purpose again. Eva and Isabella became inseparable, their endless games and chats filling the days with joy. What had begun as a simple friendship between them soon grew into a deep bond, almost as if they were sisters. They ran through the hallways, shared secrets and dreams, and together began creating new memories in that renewed home. Sophia, always present, remained a constant source of comfort and support for everyone. Her wisdom and patience seemed limitless, and her presence was like a balm that healed the invisible wounds still lingering in some hearts. Finally, the day of the long-awaited concert arrived. The music room of the mansion, which had long been a space filled with painful memories for Sergio, was now transformed. Not just by the decor, but by the warmth and energy of the people who filled it. That room, once a witness to moments of loneliness and sorrow, was now full of friendly faces, people who had found a place in Sergio's life and who now shared with him a sense of family. Maria, Sophia, Ricardo, Isabella, and Eva were all there along with other close friends, eagerly awaiting the moment when Sergio would return to the piano. Sergio, seated before the magnificent instrument he loved so dearly, took a deep breath before he began. His fingers, which hadn't touched the keys in so long, trembled slightly as they hovered over the piano. But as the first notes emerged, the tremor disappeared, and the music flowed from his hands with sincerity that moved everyone present. Every chord, every melody, was a reflection of his journey. It wasn't just about playing music, it was about telling his story. The notes were a blend of pain, betrayal, redemption, and ultimately, peace. A peace that Sergio had sought for so long and had finally found. When the last note resonated and faded into the air, the room fell into a deep silence, as if everyone present was processing what they had just witnessed. Then, the silence was broken by warm and heartfelt applause, an applause that celebrated not just the music, but also Sergio's transformation. With a smile on his face, Sergio stood, his heart full of gratitude. He thanked everyone for being there, knowing that this moment wasn't just the end of a painful chapter, but the beginning of a new phase filled with possibilities and hope. After the concert, the house once again filled with laughter and joy. Everyone celebrated not just the music but life itself. Conversations flowed easily, jokes were exchanged, and the faces of everyone present reflected the happiness they felt at that moment. For Sergio, this was the perfect close to a difficult cycle. Looking around at the people who surrounded him, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had overcome the darkness, achieved justice, and most importantly, found a new family in those who had stood by him through his hardest times. The road ahead would still be long, and Sergio knew it. There would be challenges and moments of doubt, but this time, he wouldn't be alone. He was now surrounded by people who loved him, who supported him, and who had proven that no matter how great the obstacles, there was always a way forward, to find redemption and heal. Ultimately, what resonates most in this story is the incredible capacity of humans to overcome adversity. Sergio, once trapped in a life of shadows, discovered that true strength does not lie in what the eyes can see, but in what the heart can endure and overcome. His physical blindness was only part of his struggle. The emotional darkness was his real challenge, and it was there in the deepest part of that abyss that he found his greatest strength. This story teaches us that although life can take us down unpredictable and painful paths, there is always the possibility to rebuild, to heal, and to start anew. Betrayal, pain, and loss are inevitable parts of the human experience, but so are love, hope, and redemption. Every ending is the prelude to a new beginning, and within every defeat lies the seed of a future victory. In the end, Sergio not only regained his life but also found renewed purpose, a family that supported him, and most importantly, peace with himself. He reminds us that, though life's scars may run deep, they can also be beautiful. They are a testament to our capacity to endure, to heal, and to find the light even in the darkest moments. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it and want to explore more heartfelt stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends. Remember, every story has something to teach us, and together we can discover it. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you in the next story. Take care.